I think it is apropos that we continue talking about this particular chapter. Will be the fourth chapter of our look at this story of Christmas. We're going to be talking about these Magi. And they did appear after what we would consider to be, historically, they did come on the scene after what we would consider to be the Christmas story of the Nativity. So it is apropos that although that is behind us now, these gentlemen come on the scene and we have an opportunity to discuss them and to figure out a little bit of just what was going on. Just by way of introductory words, I'm going to read again just the first couple of verses of Matthew chapter 2, just to give you that sense of where we're going. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born, King of the Jews?" This is the phrase of the verse that I want to rest our time in this morning. "We saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." The response of the wise men, I'll just read it again. We saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. The response of the wise men, the response of the Magi, was that of worship. Now, just by way of explanation, I just want to give us perhaps a bit of a better understanding maybe of that word worship. Let's just take a little bit of time and make sure we're all on the same page about this thing, because that's ultimately where this text is taking us, and that's the proper response to this news and what they have discovered. What do you know about this word worship? We often think of it perhaps as a time when we gather on a Sunday morning and we sing some songs, and I sing a song and now I'm worshiping. Sometimes we use it in different ways and different means, and we all kind of, seems like, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit foggy on just what exactly that is. Well, I think it's helpful if we look at even the way that we use the word in English. This is the way that we really mean the word worship. This is just an expression. We would say this in English. She worships the ground he walks on. Now, that's not gender specific for any particular reason. Don't read between the lines there. I just happen to word it that way. You can put he and she, bit, versibly, whatever, okay? She worships the ground he walks on. What do we mean when we'll say an expression like that? Do we mean that he walks through the house and she comes behind with an X-Acto knife and is cutting out the squares of carpet and then puts them up in some sacred place in the house, and then later on begins to bow down and pray to these things? I mean, clearly no. She's not walking through the yard and she's following with a shovel, taking divots of grass and taking it, and now she's going to, what is that? Why do we say, what does that mean? What an odd expression. Now, you've heard that, maybe you've not used it, but you understand what we mean when we say that. What we're talking about is she worships, or he worships, depending on how you want to look at this, all things associated with that person. Everything that that person touches is held in high regard. She worships the ground he walks on. If he's involved in this, then it's important to me too. Anything that's got to do with him has got to do with me. I put my focus on those things. That's worship. Now reverse that. Look at it that way. The ground he walks on, that Christ walks on, we worship it. Not literally the ground, but anything that is associated with him. Anything that comes in contact with him, we hold in high esteem. We hold this book up because we recognize this is the Word of Christ. And we worship him through this book. This book is important to us. We hold it up within our families. We regard it as an important book. It's not just one among others. We worship him by putting regard to his people. We recognize that he walks among us and we among him. And the church is important to us because we realize that it's important to Christ. And anything that's important to him, we hold it dear. We worship him by caring for the church, by loving each other. We worship him by being a part of anything that's associated with who he is. If he's been there, if he's touched it, if it's got something to do with him, then I'm a part of it. Because in so doing, I am worshiping him. I'm responding to my God. We'll say this expression as well. He worships, and again, this is not gender specific. Don't read between the lines. He worships his car, or his boat, his house, whatever the case, fill in the blank. Oh, where is he? Oh, he's out on his way. He worships that thing. And clearly we know he's not there in the dockyard with some incense and candles and bowing down on a carpet, and we realize that not what's going on, but we use this expression. What do we mean? We mean exactly what that sounds like. He is going to do whatever it takes to look after that item. His boat is so important that at exactly the right time of year, he makes sure it's out of the water and dry docked or whatever the thing you have to do. And he makes sure that the cottage is just so all the time. And take your shoes off when you come in the house or whatever the case would be. You're looking after the things that are important to you. And we use that expression of somebody who's gone to the extreme. Don't touch that car. You haven't cut your fingernails this week. You might scratch the paint. Whatever crazy, ludicrous thing that we pin on somebody worships that car. We just mean he does whatever he has to do to protect the thing of highest value. And he cares for it. And he adores it to such a degree. Isn't that exactly what we mean when we're talking about worship in regards to Christ? We're talking about an investment of our time. This is where our energies are focused. Our lives are directed at the things of God. Our time, our resources, however scant or great they may be, they're directed at the things of God. Our focus, our thought, our minds are towards Christ. That's what we mean. And that's what we're talking about. We're saying that the wise men have come to invest their time, their energies, anything associated with this child. We're in on it. We want to be a part of this. And they literally came and physically responded to it. Now, just so we're all clear, we're all seeing where we're headed here. We're just going to spend a bit of time looking at what we have here as this word, wise men. Now, in the reading that we had this morning, the translation used the literal Greek word, Magi. And that's interchangeable. We're not even really sure all that's going on, and hopefully I'll get into that, and maybe you'll find it a little tedious to go through too much of the history. There is some measure of a vacuum of information about what this means, the wise men. And this is the problem, this is what happens. Whenever there's a vacuum of information, as humans, we have a tendency to fill that vacuum with ideas of our own. And ultimately, sometimes what we end up is with a mythology that isn't really the Christmas story. And you and I have seen something of, if I can be polite enough to say, that mythology when we have nativity scenes and then count of three kings who come in with count of three exact gifts, and they come in to the baby Jesus and go down to the manger and all the rest. We have no really idea who these people are or what's going on, but we have taken the spaces and filled it with ideas. During the Middle Ages, a legend developed that they were literally kings. There were three exactly. They actually gave them names. Caspar, Belshazzar, Melchiah, or something, I'm not even sure. One of them, they were thought to represent the three sons of Noah. So one of them, because Noah's three sons went off, and one went to Africa, so one of the men, one of the kings, then was dark-skinned because he came from Africa. And all that mythology is birthed because we really don't know what's going on. None of that is biblical. This is what we know. Behold, wise men from the east. Now that's just too curious for us, and our imaginations get a little bit wild. So let's just take a bit of time, if you will, and I just put this is not rocket science. In fact, you can tell this was a Christmas week because my outline is about as kindergarten as anybody could make it. Who are the wise men? This is just to kind of break up the text. You have some place to see, some stepping stones so you can see how we're working through and understand where we're putting our thoughts. We're going to ask these questions. Who are the wise men? How did they find him? And I know some of you are all like, oh, pick me, pick me. Oh, I know, it's a star. Oh, pick me. Just relax. Actually more complicated than that. So it's going to be more interesting than you ever think. And what did they do with him? Well, I think I already kind of answered that question, but we'll fill that out just a little bit more. So let's look at these in turn. Who are the wise men? What's going on? If you don't mind, I'm going to give you just a bit of history. If you find that to be a little bit tedious, you'll probably have to just get over it. Magi. What is this word? Where does this word come from? Why does one translation say Magi, another translation wise men? Who are they? What's going on? What is this about? Let me just explain something to you. The word Magi comes from the Greek word, literally in the text it says Magi, and in plural it's Magos. Okay? And the Greek word Magi comes from Magos. What does Magos mean? Well, in the New Testament, There's a usage of a derivative of the word in Acts chapter 8. There was a man named Simeon who had previously practiced magic. That's the word in the city. And amazed the nation of Samaria, saying that he himself was somebody great. They all gave heed to him, released to the greatest, saying this man is the power of God, which is called great. They gave heed to him because for a long time he had amazed them with his, there's the word. That's a derivative of the word magos. That's what it means. In fact, that is exactly how in English we have come to find our English word is derived from the word magi. Our English word magic and all its variations, magician and magical and all the rest. That's where it comes from. So is that what we're saying? That these men were some sort of magicians? Is that what this is? These were some sort of mystical magic people? Well, let's go back farther from the New Testament. Again, thank you for your patience with this, but I think it's apropos and helpful. The word magos in Greek actually comes where we get our English word magic. That word, you can trace that word back century, and it actually goes back deep into Persia. That's where they got their word from. So if you go back far enough, now the reason we're doing this little lesson, or this little study, is because this is where you have to go. You end up looking through shards of information and try and put together the pieces because we have so little information. So Persia was a vast empire, not that you don't know this from grade 8 geography, but just for the sake of it in grade 10 history. Who was Andrew here this morning? He's not. He would be able to come up and give us a great little lesson on things that I can't fill in the blank for. So, being the history teacher that he is, Persia was a great empire. You've probably heard of it. Modern day Iraq, I think it's Iran, Turkey, all swallowed up into that great hunk of land. That is where this word was birthed and came from. In 722, Israel was taken captive to that very region. Last we will get there. So, that's where the word comes from, but what are the Magi? Who are they? Let me just explain where the word comes from out of Persia. If you, again, just be patient with this bit of history. The Magi were a religious caste. We don't have a caste system in Canada. I think India is the only country that I'm aware on earth presently, and I'm obviously not aware of everything, that has still a caste system that's even illegal but still used. Where you're born in a particular level of society, and then that determines your worth. And if you're low on the totem pole, to what part of the expression, then you don't really count as compared to somebody who's up here because they're born in a different bloodline. We don't have that, obviously, and thankfully, it's not a helpful expression. But that's what happened. There was a caste system, and it began with a man named Zoroaster. Okay? I'm just telling you, it goes all the way back to the 6th century BC into Persia. This man Zoroaster began a religion. He began, I can't even pronounce it, Zoroastrianism, I think. Okay? And his family, and this began to take root and began to get notice, as religions sometimes do, and sometimes they fade and sometimes they blossom. It still exists today, although it's very rare, but it does still exist as a religion. And everybody who was born into his family became a part of his clan, and ultimately, this religion became so popular that Darius the Great, the king of Persia, instated it as the state religion. And now everybody who was born of that line of this man in this caste system became known as the Magi. That was the name of this caste system. They ultimately became very powerful, very important within the culture, and no Persian could be crowned king, ultimately, unless they mastered the teachings of the Magi. Okay, so this is where probably where we get our idea that we three kings, because we assume, well, they're Magi, that's Persian king related. Doesn't mean that they were literally kings. It means that no king could be a king without the Magi's crowning them. All right, so that's a bit of who they are. Thank you again for your patience. But what in the world did they believe? What did they teach? The religion is actually very, very similar to Judaism in some ways. They believe in one God, Almighty God, that created everything, and there's some overlap in things, and ultimately a very different system, but not all that far away. This is what the Magi paid attention to. Believe it or not, surprise, surprise, they paid particular attention to the stars. And through their studies, they began to understand that there was something going on. The ancient world now was dark. People didn't understand what was happening, but they began to recognize patterns in the sky. They began to see that those stars are shaped like that at this time of year. And they began to connect the dots and see the pattern. And then they would realize now they're over here and now there's a new pattern. And they watched and realized there's patterns going on. And they began to realize that there was a thing called seasons. And something was happening that nobody else knew about. And they had figured it out by watching the stars. They gained an international reputation for their astrology. And they began to be what we would call scientists back then. But the word scientist to us and them is different. But back then, think about it, it's dark age. They didn't understand things about the earth and things that we know now. And you can imagine what happens. Here these men are, and they would say, for example, they figured this all out, they've watched, they've calculated, they've understood, they've done all their charts, they've done all this math, they've figured this out, and they've now said, for example, I'm making this up, the sun will rise tomorrow at exactly 7:32. Everyone else in the world is thinking, that's impossible. How could you know that? What are you predicting the future? How could you know when the sun's going to rise exactly? That doesn't make any sense. And lo and behold, it does! Because they understand the system, they've gone and figured out. And what does that make them look like? Magicians. How did you know that? How could you predict the future? How could you understand what was going to take place? And they began to be seen as great wise men, the men of all knowledge. And the religious practices and use of astrology ultimately came to be applied to anything that was mysterious, anything that couldn't be understood, all those dark arts, and ultimately has evolved into our use of the word magic. So all that to explain to you what we're dealing with here. We'll get practical eventually, just bear with me. Who are the wise men? Who are we talking about? We're talking about a caste of priests, ancient astrologers, from an ancient pagan religion, living in a very, very distant land. That's what we mean when we say, and wise men from the east. How in the world did they show up? What do they have to do with a Jewish king? The mystery is extraordinary. Well, how did they find him? Well, again, I think the answer seems obvious, but let's just go back again, pardon the history, but I mentioned to you already that Judah was taken captive into Babylon. But God, not to give you too much history, but God had warned Israel, if you don't behave, you don't behave, you don't behave, we're going to send in a nation and you're going to be disciplined. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. He sent in King Nebuchadnezzar at one point, and they captured them and brought them back to Babylon. And you know the story of how Daniel and his three friends ended up in the court of Babylon. And you know also the story of how Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he has a dream, and he can't understand his dream, and he decides to put these so-called wise men, these so-called magicians, these men who understand all these deep things that I don't get, I'm going to put them to the test. Tell me what my dream was and what it means. You know the story. The wise men scramble around. I can tell you when the sun's going to rise tomorrow and what time of year it is and what sign the stars are, but I have no idea what dreams have to do with anything. And they were panicked. So in chapter 2, we have this little phrase to set the stage here. Daniel 2:4. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon, because they couldn't answer, that's wise men, that's Magi, that's what we're talking about. He went and said to them, thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. You know the story. You know that Daniel presents to them a God who is greater than their knowledge. He introduces to them an idea that there is knowledge that can be found beyond what they know in their scientific means. And here's what happens. 2:48. The king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the Magi, over all the wise men of Babylon. And now this Jewish man, who is well endowed with the things of God and knows his scripture, is now in charge of the Magi. Now we are reading between the lines. I'll tell you that right now. But it seems that what has happened is that even back then, the God of Israel began to have his influence on this pagan world. And they began to see something of who this God was, even though they had their own religion and their own scientific ideas. And in fact, Numbers 24, verse 17, before you're finding this gets any more tedious than you discovered it is, Numbers 24, 17 is a prophecy of the Messiah. And it says this: I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. So, I can see him, he's a person, he's a him, but he's not of this age. I can tell he's going to be a person, but he's not near here. A star shall come out of Jacob. Now, Jacob is the name of obviously Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, who ultimately had his name changed to Israel, who is the father, if you will, of Israel. And those are interchangeable in a sense. And the star shall come out of Jacob. So it means of the line of Jacob, and it means, and that's the word star, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And a scepter is, of course, something that a king holds. Now you can imagine, and again, this is presumption, but I think it's a pretty good accurate presumption, that Daniel has come to Babylon. He's now chief over the prefects. He brings his Torah with him. He begins to teach them and tell them perhaps the things of God, or at least influence them in some way. He leaves this book with them, perhaps even when he comes back to Israel. They begin to study it. They've seen what his God can do, and his God of might and mystery, and he knows mysteries that they don't understand, and they study this book, and perhaps they've even come across these very words, that a star will rise, and that will be a scepter in his hand. Now, for centuries, these pagan kings in ancient Babylon have begun to wonder, is there something in the sky? Well, lo and behold, it's exactly what happens. Matthew 2, 9 and 10, you're familiar with these words. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star they had seen when it rose went before them. What is that star? There's a lot of conjecture about this star, and some people would tell you that it was... Let me just cut to the chase. I don't believe it was an actual physical, literal star. This is just my opinion. It comes to you free of charge. You can chuck it out, you can throw it away, you can do what you want with it. I've got the text in front of me as much as you do. I'm reading what you can read. A star rose. What do I know what it says? But I can tell you this by what's going on in the text. It doesn't look and act like a star like you and I think of a star. Why is it that we think the star was some huge, giant thing that nobody else noticed, but these guys did? Nobody else saw this bulbous, immense, ridiculously sized, giant thing moving through the sky. Everybody ignored it, and these men show up and say, what's that star? What star? What do you mean? Didn't see anything. There's something going on that's, it seems, is supernatural. I don't think it's a literal star. I think this is a sign from God, whether it is an angel, whether it's the glory of God, I don't know. But they take it as a star. They read the stars, and God uses it to bring these pagan kings to Israel to worship the king. Now again, we're just getting to the practical here. Just bear with me. Lots of history, lots of groundwork. Eventually we'll get to where this takes us. So, how did they find him? Well, probably Daniel's influence of the scriptures, prophecies of scripture, and the star. Whatever that means, I can't tell you, but I think it was God himself who was leading them. We've already covered this. What did they do with him? I think I've mentioned this already as we've looked at this. They saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. What did they do in verse 11? Going into the house, by the way, I just have to say this as an aside, that is the word house, not the word stable. Just to clarify, clear some of our mythology to death, which I think we're mostly clear on. But the time that they arrived is not the night that Jesus is born. They saw what was happening, and they traveled a great distance, and then Herod says to them, and assesses for them what time they arrived, and then says, kill every child 2 years and younger. Probably took them 2 years to arrive. Jesus is probably 2 years old, and they find him at their house. Sorry to disturb your ideas of your nativity scene. When you get home, you can take those clay guys off of the thing and put them far away to Babylon because they haven't even come yet. Okay? It's all good. We know that's just pictorial and we get the point. But just for the sake of record, that's probably more likely what happened. Well and truly, the nativity is behind them, the birth of Christ, Bethlehem, all of that, shepherds, history. Lo and behold, there's a knock on the door, and what is this? And the only reason we've come up with the number 3 is because we have 3 representations of gifts. But let's get there in a moment. They worshipped him. You see the order that this comes in? They worshipped him. Then, as a response to their worship, they offered him, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts. These famous gifts, of course, we won't spend a lot of time on, but you can see what's going on here. We end up with this idea that there were 3. They probably didn't travel with just 3, such a great distance. There's probably a great team of them, and they may have had multiple gifts of gold and multiple gifts of frankincense and multiple, there are just 3 categories. We don't even know what's going on. Just to tell you, just to give you maybe a clearer picture of what your ideas are of what this story is. Needless to say, how did they respond to him? Well, what have I said so far? Gold. I don't need to tell you what gold is. I'm pretty sure you've got that. Most of you have that hung around your neck or on your finger. Frankincense, not something that we're familiar with, but an ancient spice. Came in many types, and quality was based on color, purity, aroma, age, shape, that kind of thing. It's a biological product, comes from a plant, and could be used, oil could be derived from it. It was used as incense and various things. And then myrrh, again, is not something we have in our country, but we get maple syrup from sap that comes out of a maple tree. You cut a maple and it will bleed sap, and it's liquid and it stays liquid. Unless you boil it, then it becomes gold. Delicious, fabulous stuff. If you cut a myrrh, a particular shrub from ancient Near East, it'll bleed. The pitch that comes out will come out as a big bulb, and it'll eventually, as it gets to air, it will go hard. And you'll pick them off with the size of a walnut. And they would bleed these out and pick them off, and you would grind it up, and it had extraordinary medicinal purposes and all kinds of uses that they came up with it, and ultimately was turned into oils as well. They brought, I'll not get into the history or the background of that, you can be thankful. But needless to say, they worshipped him. Now, I've already explained to you what worship is, but I want you to try to get your head around this because we're about to get practical now as we put a big bow on this discussion. There are pagan kings who have absolutely nothing to do with the God of Israel, who have no background with him, have no cultural interest in him. There is nothing to do with him that has anything to do with them. They're as far away from God, if you will, as you can find. And yet, there is some information that comes to them. These little shards of information, these little glimmers of understanding. Something is supposed to happen in the future in Israel. A Messiah will come. And that they perhaps read in Scripture, a star will rise. And they see this thing, and they start to put together, and they begin in their wisdom to decide that they need to go in that direction. And they figure out how it is. I don't know. If I see a star, I don't say, oh yeah, something's happened in the name of country, and name what's happened. How could you possibly know? But they do that. And they've done this incredible adventure with these little shards of information, just hoping to find the answer to the great mystery. And they wander for perhaps up to 2 years. They come into Israel. They're not even sure where they're going. They're asking people, do you know? Do you know? They finally come to the king. Surely the king knows. The king has no idea. They can't even, the mystery's gone. They have no, there's their star again. They celebrate. There it is. There it is. And now it leads them exactly to who they're looking for. And what do? They respond. They have never met this person. They don't know anything about this person. They hardly know anything what's going on. And their whole hearts, they now say, what you touch is important to me. Who you are is now what I want to know. What I have, I now invest in you. Everything about you, I now commit myself to you. You are now my goddess. They bowed down, they prostrated themselves, and they poured themselves out before him. They worshipped him. Do you understand? This is not just a passing, they need to come out and scrape and say a little prayer and here's some stuff, and thanks for the visit and cookies, and they leave. No. This is them committing their way to this God, to this king, to this man. They don't even know who he is. Do you see what this story is? This story is you, and this story is me. And I don't say you just because you're in church this morning, because that isn't the case. You can be here this morning and never be a wise man. We are the wise man if you know Christ. We have come to know him through information that has come to us. We were born far and away separated from him. We are not of the covenants of Israel. We are not born under God's blessing. We are far and away pagans. Our hearts, my heart, your heart, has been born in complete rebellion against him. God is a bore. God is a drag. God is a big wet blanket that puts things on my life that I don't want. I'll show up in church if I have to. But the truth is, I want to run my life my way and do my thing. And in truth be known, I hate him. I don't want anything to do with him. That's your heart. That's my heart. Something has happened. Something happened. Something happened to the true wise men in this room. They got some shards of information. Something came to them and they realized there was light. There was some truth in this person. There was something here more than meets the eye. There was something about this boy and the child in the manger and this whole story and the cross. There was something there. And they began to follow this light, if you will. They began to seek this man out. They began to discover what this story is. They began to let this thing unfold. And something happened in the wise men of today. That story took root and blossomed. And they were given new life. Some of you this morning are wise men. Not just because you're here, but because you've had that experience of exactly what I'm talking about. You know your dark heart was far and away separated from God. And you know that God himself has brought you. He's given you. He's been leading you his whole life. And he's shown you where to find life. He's shown you where to find life. And truth. And joy. And peace. And all those things you thought was not true of God, was true of God rather, you find are not true of him. He's not a big wet blanket. He is joy. He's not the one who just makes my life miserable because I got to follow a bunch of rules. No, I love these rules. No, I want to follow him. So what is your response? We only have one response. You, as a follower of Christ, commit your way to him with a worship that is deeper than the world could ever produce. Your time, your life, your energies are poured out. Anything this man touches, any place he walks, I worship him. I will be a part of that thing. I will show up in church on Sunday, not because I just go through the motions of going in church. No, because I love God. Because I serve Christ. Because I worship him. And he's a part of this. I'm a part of this. He's doing something in our midst. I'm going to put my hand in my pocket and pull out something. This is not a plea for an offering. I'm just telling you as an example of how we respond. I put something in the offering plate. Not because, I have to do that. The church has to keep the lights on. No. I worship him. And anything to do with him, I'm investing my time. I invest my energies. I invest my direction. It is my life focus now. I have come, I bow down before him, and I pour my gifts out. I pour myself out. You see the wise men? They are in this room. And there is only one response. It is not a half-hearted, kind of lazy sort of going through life, saving money in the bank for yourself, but really, okay, I guess I should love God once in a while and give him a little bit of something. No, that's not worship. That's selfishness. Worship is you pouring out who you are to the God who has been revealed to you by the light of God's star in your own heart. We are the Magi. And this